think that there's one habit that separates the men who quit porn from those who don't. And it's actually a lot more simple than you might realize. If you don't know me, my name is Krishna, and I help young men quit their porn addictions by teaching the lessons that I personally learned throughout my journey. And so this habit actually helped, I would say it helped me quite a bit. And I was only going maybe like 4 days max after, 4 days max without relapsing. And then eventually, as I started doing this habit, I was able to get to 2 weeks. I was slowly able to start quitting porn more and more and more. I was slowly able to go more days without relapsing. Eventually now, when I look back on it, it's been 4 years since I've last watched porn. 4 years, and I haven't touched anything like that. And so the habit is something that I'm going to call relapse auditing. I'll explain what that is. I think that the number one reason that most guys struggle with porn, you probably agree with this as well, is because of relapses. It makes sense. You try and quit porn, you learn about NoFap, you learn about all these things, you learn about the habits that you know you need to do, but you keep relapsing. And you can stay stuck in that cycle of relapse after relapse after relapse over and over and over and over again. So why don't we learn from them? Why is it that nobody talks about learning from these relapses? Because relapses are a natural part of the addiction process. They are a natural part. But you need to analyze them in order to make progress. And so to analyze, you need to ask where you were, what were you doing, and why were you doing it? Where you were, what were you doing, why were you doing it, and what you can replace that thing with. And I'll explain each of these things in more detail. So, where you were, I think this is actually really important because environment plays a huge role when it comes to addiction. There's a story about during the Vietnam War when a lot of the US soldiers, when they went to Vietnam, they got addicted to opioids. But what's interesting, and opioids again is a really, really strong, really, really addictive substance. But what's interesting is that when they went back home, when they went back to the US, they weren't addicted anymore. They weren't addicted to opioids. Why? Because they changed their environment. Environment plays a bigger role in addiction than you might think. Because if you relapse consistently, or if you get an urge consistently in a place, in one spot, your brain is going to start to associate that spot with the urge and with relapsing. So where you were, what were you doing? Right? What were you actually doing in that spot? Were you scrolling on your phone on Instagram? Were you playing video games? Were you watching YouTube? And why? Why were you doing that thing? Why were you scrolling on TikTok? Why were you scrolling on Instagram? Why were you playing video games? What you're doing and why you're doing it. I think those two are important because what you're doing can give us an insight into what it is that you can replace it with. For example, let's talk about some of my relapses. I would consistently relapse in my room when I was scrolling on Instagram, looking at women, obviously, and I would get urges there. It would be after school, and then I would relapse. So I was in my room, I was on Instagram, and I was on Instagram because I wanted to escape. I wanted to not think about some of the things I was avoiding, right? I was avoiding the homework that I needed to do because it was after school. I was avoiding my dad who was abusive. I was avoiding my mental health, my depression, right? I was avoiding all of those things. What could I replace that with? Well, instead of maybe escaping to Instagram, probably a healthier thing to do might be to escape to a book, for example, might be to escape to the gym, or it might be to actually do that homework that I know I should be doing, but I'm not. I feel doing that sort of process is going to give you a lot of insight into what it is that you should be doing. And so your actionable step for this video is just to write down just one simple audit for one of your relapses, right? Using that framework, where you were, what were you doing, and why, and also what can you replace that thing with, right? So where you were might be, you might be in your room, it might be after school. What you're doing, you're probably scrolling on Instagram. You know, you had your feet up on the bed, on the leg rest or whatever, right? You're scrolling, you're bored. Why you were doing it? Well, maybe there was that homework that you knew you needed to do, but you weren't doing it, and so you're using Instagram to avoid that. Maybe it's the poor mental health that you deal with, your depression, your anxiety. Maybe it's trauma, right? You're using it to avoid something. What can you replace that with? Well, you could probably replace it with a healthier way to cope. Maybe it could be going outside for a walk, for example. Maybe it could be going to the gym. Maybe it could be reading a book. Maybe it could be playing a sport that you like, right? Those are healthier ways to cope with those things. And so I think really just doing that will help you. And it helped me quite a bit to just audit my relapses and say, why did this happen, right? What was the actual step-by-step things that happened? What was I feeling? What was I doing, right, before the relapse? And if we can address that, if we can address triggers, for example, then we can work to actually slowly quit. But it all starts with addressing the relapses, right? Because a lot of people, relapses are actually just data points. They're potential data points for you to analyze, right? There's data that comes from the relapses that you can use to then quit. If you find that this video helped you, and you want to go more in depth into the actual science, the step-by-step things that you can do to quit porn, I have a program. It has 5 main phases, 5 things that you can do to quit porn. All you have to do is just follow them step by step. If you're interested in that, then you can go and you can click the link in the description down below. Take care, bro.